Waymo's Robotaxis can navigate rush-hour traffic and identify a pedestrian stepping off a curb 300 feet away, but a 6-inch deep puddle across a street can force the company to pause operations across an entire city. Why does a $200,000 self-driving car fail at something a 16-year-old with a learner's permit handles instinctively? In April 2025, Waymo temporarily suspended its autonomous ride-hailing service in Atlanta after multiple robotaxis drove into flooded streets during heavy spring storms. The cars didn't crash, they just kept driving through water deep enough to potentially damage their electronics, forcing remote operators to intervene. This wasn't a one-off glitch. It's a symptom of a deeper problem that explains why self-driving cars, despite billions in investment and millions of test miles, still can't operate everywhere a human driver can. The issue isn't that autonomous vehicles can't handle weather. Waymo operates successfully in San Francisco's fog and Phoenix's dust storms. The specific challenge is standing water on roads, which creates what engineers call a multimodal sensor failure. Every detection system fails in a different way, and combining them doesn't solve the problem. Understanding why requires looking at how each sensor type perceives the world, and more importantly, what it can't see. Start with Lidar, the spinning cylinder mounted on top of most robotaxis. Lidar works by firing laser pulses, typically at 905 or 1,550 nanometer wavelengths, and measuring how long they take to bounce back. A high-end automotive Lidar fires roughly 1 million pulses per second across a 360-degree field, building a three-dimensional point cloud of everything around the vehicle with centimeter-level precision. It's why self-driving cars can detect a stopped car 200 meters ahead, even in total darkness. But Lidar has a fundamental weakness. It measures surfaces, not materials. When a Lidar pulse hits a dry asphalt road, it bounces back cleanly, telling the system exactly where the ground is. When it hits standing water, physics gets messy. Smooth water acts like a mirror for infrared light. Most of the pulse reflects away at an angle instead of returning to the sensor. The Lidar sees either nothing, interpreting the area as empty drivable space, or it sees the reflection of something else entirely. A street sign reflected in the puddle might register as an object sitting in the road. Worse, water ripples from wind or passing cars randomize the reflections, so the same puddle looks different every millisecond. The Lidar can't tell the difference between a wet road, a shallow flood, or a missing section of pavement. All three produce similar sparse return patterns. Cameras seem like the obvious backup. Humans use vision to avoid floods, so why can't computer vision do the same? Modern autonomous vehicles use between 6 and 12 cameras positioned around the vehicle, each capturing high-resolution color images at 30 to 60 frames per second. Machine learning models trained on millions of labeled images can identify lanes, traffic lights, pedestrians, and hundreds of other object classes. But cameras don't measure depth directly, they infer it from context. A human driver sees water across a road and recognizes the visual cues, reflections, the texture of moving water, the way light behaves differently on a wet surface versus dry pavement. We're trained by a lifetime of experience. Training an AI to recognize standing water is harder than it sounds. The visual signature of a flooded road varies enormously depending on lighting, time of day, water clarity, and whether there's debris floating in it. A puddle in bright sunlight looks completely different from the same puddle at night under streetlights. Rain falling on standing water creates one pattern. Still water after the rain stops creates another. And here's the killer. Wet pavement and shallow standing water often look nearly identical in a camera image. Both are dark, both reflect light, both show mirror images of surroundings. A camera-based system confident enough to stop for every potential flood would also stop for every wet road, rendering the vehicle useless in any city where it rains. Calibrating the threshold, what counts as drivable wet pavement versus dangerous standing water, is a classification problem with no clean answer. That brings us to radar, the third pillar of autonomous vehicle sensing. Automotive radar typically operates at 77 GHz, sending out radio waves and analyzing the reflections to detect objects and measure their speed via Doppler shift. Radar works through fog, rain, and snow, conditions that blind cameras and degrade Lidar. It's essential for detecting fast-moving vehicles in poor visibility. But radar is optimized for tracking discrete objects, not characterizing road surfaces. The radio waves penetrate water easily. A shallow flood is essentially transparent to radar. The system might detect a car on the other side of the water, but the water itself produces minimal reflection. Even when radar does bounce off a water surface, it can't reliably distinguish between a thin layer and a deep pool. Depth sensing would require extremely precise phase measurements that current automotive radar systems don't provide. So if Lidar, cameras, and radar each fail independently, what about HD maps, the pre-built three-dimensional maps that autonomous vehicles use as a reference? Waymo's HD maps are built by survey vehicles that drive every street in the service area, recording lane positions, curb heights, traffic signs, and permanent landmarks down to centimeter accuracy. The Robotaxi compares its real-time sensor data against this map to localize itself precisely and predict what it should see around each curve. These maps are extraordinary pieces of engineering, updated regularly as construction changes roads. But they're fundamentally static. They know where the road is supposed to be, not where water might be after a storm. A map can't predict that the intersection of 10th Street and Peachtree floods to 8 inches during heavy rain because of a clogged storm drain. That's dynamic information, and HD maps don't include real-time weather or drainage infrastructure modeling. This is where sensor fusion comes in. The idea that combining data from Lidar, cameras, radar, and maps produces a more reliable picture than any single source. And sensor fusion does work remarkably well for most driving scenarios. If Lidar detects an object but cameras don't, the system cross-references radar and motion patterns to decide if it's real. Redundancy handles individual sensor failures. But flooding creates a correlated failure mode. All the sensors fail in ways that happen to align. Lidar returns sparse data, suggesting open space. Cameras see wet pavement, which the system is trained to treat as drivable. Radar sees through the water entirely. The HD map says there's a road there, which is technically true. There is a road, it's just underwater. Every input tells the vehicle it's safe to proceed, because the system has no ground truth for water depth. What happened in Atlanta was the result of this perfect storm. The city experienced intense rainfall, over 3 inches in less than 2 hours in some areas, that overwhelmed storm drains and created standing water across multiple intersections. Waymo's vehicles encountered flooded roads they had driven successfully hundreds of times before. With no reliable sensor method to detect the water depth, and with maps indicating those roads were normally passable, the cars proceeded. Some drove through water deep enough that remote safety operators monitoring the fleet had to intervene and instruct the vehicles to pull over. No crashes occurred, and the water apparently didn't reach levels that damaged the vehicle's electronics, which are positioned high in the chassis for exactly this reason. But the incidents demonstrated that the cars couldn't autonomously detect and avoid the hazard. Waymo paused Atlanta operations not because the cars were unsafe, but because the company couldn't guarantee they would avoid similar situations in the next storm. This incident reveals something important about the current state of autonomous vehicle technology. It's not the dramatic failures that limit deployment, it's the edge cases. Waymo's vehicles have driven over 20 million fully autonomous miles on public roads without causing a fatal crash. The core technology for highway driving, navigation, and standard urban scenarios is genuinely mature. But flooding is what engineers call a long-tail problem, an uncommon scenario that's difficult to train for and impossible to completely solve with current sensors. Every geographic region has its own set of these edge cases. Flooding in Atlanta, lake effect snow squalls in Cleveland, dust storms in Phoenix, coastal fog in San Francisco, ice storms in Boston. Each creates a different sensor challenge. The industry's response has been to limit where autonomous vehicles operate rather than solve every edge case. Waymo chose Atlanta in part because the weather is relatively mild and predictable, and then discovered that even mild climates produce scenarios the vehicles can't handle. This is why fully autonomous services remain confined to a handful of cities with favorable conditions, and why each expansion requires months of testing. It's also why the promise of autonomous vehicles operating everywhere, in all conditions, remains years away despite the technology working well within constrained environments. The flooding problem likely won't be solved by better versions of existing sensors. It will require new sensing modalities, perhaps ground-penetrating radar specifically tuned for water depth, or thermal imaging to detect temperature differences between asphalt and standing water, or a fundamental shift in how autonomous systems make decisions under uncertainty. Waymo's Robotaxis stopping for floods isn't a failure of engineering. It's evidence that the engineers actually understand the limits of their sensors and are willing to halt operations rather than push through conditions they can't reliably handle. The cars didn't crash. They just revealed that a 6-inch puddle poses a detection problem that billions of dollars in Lidar, cameras, and AI haven't yet solved. That's how it actually works. If you want more deep dives into the engineering behind the systems we take for granted, subscribe. There's a new video every week.